Tomorrow morning, we will read what you know will be a challenging portion of the Torah if we pay attention to it. It's Akedat Yitzchak, which means the binding of Isaac. And the binding of Isaac binds all of us in questions, mostly, more than answers. God is testing Abraham, but we might ask ourselves, if God is really testing Abraham when God knows, presumably, if God is God, what the outcome of the test will be before it's even begun. So the question then becomes, if it's not testing Abraham, what is it saying to us, we the people of the book, who read that book, for answers to the questions of our lives? What's it saying to us about what it means to be human and living in relationship to God? What does it say to even have a concept of the word God in Hebrew or English, or in our heart, a language that no one else knows? To live in relationship to something intangible yet knowable. What I want to talk to you about is 2 generations and a few chapters after that little story. And it's an insignificant moment in the Torah, I'll tell you in advance. And the story is that Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son Jacob, is journeying away from his home because he's gained the distrust of his brother Esau, but the birthright and the blessing of his father. And he flees to the land of Aram, and he flees to his uncle's house, to Laban, and on his way there, he sees shepherds in a field, and he comes to them, and he sees a few shepherds gathered around a well, and he sees them, and there's a stone, a large, heavy stone over the opening of the well, presumably a practical thing, to stop debris from getting in, to stop the water from evaporating. And Jacob approaches the shepherds, and he asks them, why aren't you drinking? Why aren't you feeding your sheep from the well? And they say, we can't do it until more people arrive. It's too heavy. None of us alone, or even the 2 of us, 3 of us can lift this heavy stone. And just then, in this insignificant passage of the Torah, Jacob asked, do you happen to know my uncle Laban, or Lavan? And they say, there's Lavan's daughter Rachel coming with his sheep, with Lavan's sheep. And Jacob looks and sees this woman, Rachel. Now imagine that he only sees her eyes, because that's all he saw in those days. This was the Middle East, not Northridge. And he's so struck by her beauty that in that moment, he not only sees her, but he reaches over to that heavy stone, and with ease, he pushes it off the well, and all of them feed their sheep. That's this incidental moment in a great story of our people. Jacob, who will become Israel, our grandfather of grandfathers. And yet ask yourself what it might mean. What it means to be so inspired, so struck. Maybe it's just to be animal. We see that in the animal kingdom. We see peacocks. We see men, we see women, how they react to one another. We see how people are changed by each other, strengthened by each other. We see the person who lifts a car up because somebody's trapped underneath. But ask yourself what goes in that moment, and then ask yourself what that well might represent in your life, in you. There's a beautiful Hasidic rabbi, the Ger Rebbe, known as the Sfat Emet. And in his book called the Sfat Emet, the Language of Truth, he says something so beautiful about that well in the field. He says, Yesh bechol davar nekuda hanotenet chaim. He says, there is in everything a point from which life emerges. And that's the well in the field. So to that rabbi, the well isn't simply a well to feed sheep. The well is something within every single human being that is the source of our mei chaim, of our waters of life, of the source of life within us at any age, at any point in our lives. But ask yourself if it's still in the well within you, or if it emerges and flows. Ask yourself if it comes to you and through you, but doesn't emerge from you. Maybe it's a song that you hum that other people hear only in your house. Maybe it's a symphony. Maybe it's a painting. Maybe it's a great work or a minor work of your expression of your soul, of yourself, that someone might call art. And someone else will just pass by, but it's a part of you. Ask yourself what it is. your creative force within you. When we look at the book of Genesis, we learn something about every human being, not just right-brained or left-brained human beings. We learn that God is a creative being, and we were created in the image of God, which means that every single one of us is inherently generative, inherently creative, that we don't have to be the artsy kind, the artistic kind, to consider ourselves and see within us the value of our own creative force. And if it isn't a piece of music or a painting or a sculpture, ask yourself if it isn't a reality that you create, because all of us are master creators of realities. We create realities with every choice that we make. We change the world through our choices, which means every one of us is, in small and large ways, creative. And it means that every one of us in small and in large and enlarging ways matters to the existence of this world now. That's why we're here. Not we collectively, we as individuals. Because it's our generativity, it's our creativity that's needed at this point in the world and in our lives, this world of people and relationship. If you ask yourself what it might be within you and you don't come to an answer, ask somebody else who knows you well, because all of us, like our cars, have blind spots. We only see what we can see, and we need one another to see the parts of us and to alert us to the parts of us that are absolutely and by design invisible to us, which is why we need people, not only so that we won't live alone and be lonely in this world, but so that we'll grow and be accountable and change and enlarge ourselves in this world that God gave us. So ask somebody whom you trust over the next few days, who loves you, truly loves you. Ask them what your blind spots are. Ask them what they think is within your well that never made it to the surface to this day at age 23 or 25 or 95 or 7. Because as long as we're alive, we have in that well this simmering force of life, of generativity, of God within all of us. And God wants to see it emerge from the well. Because what good does it do below? Only in the depths of our souls. I want to ask you to ask yourself what that stone over the well might be in your life. What's blocking that force of life, that source of life? What's holding it at bay? What's holding it private and within, never to emerge yet in this world? Is it anger? Is it disappointment? Is it envy? Is it the realization that there were things that didn't go perfectly in your life, all of our lives? Is it the anger and disappointment over doors that did or didn't open in your life that you still look back on? Is it regret that holds you always in the past? Because anger and envy and disappointment and regret are all words that turn us in the opposite direction of forward. They're not today's word. All of those are conditions of reflection to the past. Then ask yourself if this present moment, this you, needs to turn your head and gaze forward. And if it's difficult, ask yourself not if you have the strength in your muscles, in your back, in your legs, in your arms to push the well like Jacob did, but ask yourself if you have something else, which is insight to realize that strength within you. Inspiration to know you can do it. Ask yourself what it means to live with that holy potential within you and to have anger or disappointment or envy clouding it, blocking it from emerging into the world. I think about our power that's so unique, that is unique to us as human beings, and that's the power to reframe what was. Put a new frame around a piece of art and look at it differently. I look at a moment in life when I was in the Air Force. I was 18 years old, and I came home on brief leave because I knew exactly where I was going, and I was thrilled with exactly where the Air Force was sending me. Because they'd asked me, as they do, they ask you your preferences of where you'd like to be stationed, and my number one preference was Barcelona, Spain. And they gave me Barcelona, Spain. And I lay in bed one morning, and a knock came at my door. It was my mom pretty early in the morning. She said, Ron, there's somebody on the phone from the Air Force. I assume they're going to confirm when I'm going to be in Barcelona, Spain. And the message that I got was that I wasn't, in fact, going to Barcelona, Spain. They said, wait, stay where you are. We're changing your orders, and we'll be in touch. And I remember feeling so deflated. I remember feeling like all my image of the future, all my dreams, all the painting of what I'd already created that would be, that would happen, that I would experience, was suddenly dashed by one phone call at age 18. How dare they? The Air Force, not me. The country, not me. And a few days later, I got a call, and then a letter. And it said I was being sent to some obscure little town called Alconbury, just outside Cambridge, in the country of England in the United Kingdom. Don't look at my wife yet. And I remember looking on the map. I didn't look on the internet because there wasn't an internet. I know it's hard to believe there wasn't an internet, but there wasn't. So I looked on a map to see where is this tiny town and where is Cambridge, and what did I know about it other than a university? I didn't know that I'd meet my wife there. And I didn't know that that journey, that reluctant journey, not to Spain, but to cold, rainy, windy England, would change my story entirely. It would introduce me to a culture that would inspire me and in which I'd grow. Through art, through literature, through music, through study, through work, through friendships, through travel. And that there, just before I was leaving, after 9 years of living there reluctantly but happily, I would meet the woman that would then become my wife, the love of my life, and the parent, the mother of my children. So reframing is what we get to do. We get to step back and look back and put a different frame around the same reality and ask ourselves what our disappointment was all about. Ask ourselves if we had God's view on that point in our story or just ours, because my eyes are too small. But God's are big enough to see more than I can see in that moment. I see the pain and the anger, and I see the fear, and I see the worry, and I see the disappointment, because that's all I can see in two tiny eyes. But imagine that God looks at my story and says, just be patient, and you'll see where this is leading. Just be patient, and you realize how you will be changed for the better through the struggle of this that I'm giving and placing before you. In Joseph's story, he's beleaguered by his brothers who hate him. They say in the Hebrew. In the Torah, it says in the text that they hate their brother Joseph. And comes a point after years of them tormenting him that he confronts them. And he says, I know you meant to harm me, but God meant it for good. So what does that do but not throw the heavy stone off the well? What does it mean to let God see all of who you are, not just a portion of it? What does it mean to live not your half-life that's consumed and shrunken by anger and envy and disappointment and even hatred, but to realize not with your back and not with the strength of your arms, but just with thought and inspiration and change perspective, that with one hand you can push back the lid of that well and let the flow of life come through you. Not live a half-life at any age in life, but all of you. Not live with potential, but constantly living to your potential. Not living with hopes and dreams, but realizing that on the way to those hopes and dreams will be so many disappointments and failures and falls and rises and relationships and opportunities to grow and realize more of who you are, and you'll stand taller at the end of that journey than you ever did in the beginning. If all your eyes see in the future is worries, then imagine as you might that that well is only full of tsuris, but it isn't, because that's not what God placed in your life, a life force full of worry. That's the lid, that's the heavy stone that you choose to place on top of those mechaim, those waters of life. I remember some years ago sharing with you a story of some years ago when I was a boy. I'm still a boy, but when I was a little boy. And my parents used to have cassettes. Remember, we used to take a pencil and turn it in those things. The kids don't even know what this gesture is. And we'd stick it in the car. My parents, instead of listening to music, which we did sometimes at night, I remember they tormented us with a man with a fantastic voice and great wisdom called Earl Nightingale, because that's how he sounded. And Earl Nightingale had a series of cassettes. We listened to all of them. It was called The New Lead the Field. There was one moment I'll never forget when he talks about worry and how what worry does is it shrinks our souls. It takes our hand that's this large and it closes it into a fearful fist. And what he said was, look at all of your worries. And now think about the fact that more than 80% of them will never come true according to statistics, reality. Therefore, why worry? Now you have 20% that you're committed to. Earl Nightingale says more than 12% are things you have no control over. So why worry? Then ask yourself if what's keeping you at night is the 8% or the 92%. Ask yourself if that's worthy of you and the gifts that God gave you. Ask yourself what it means to live in a future that hasn't yet been born. The temerity, the gall of assuming outcomes that haven't yet been born. I think about us the way the parents look at their children. And we smile wistfully, we watch them grow, we see them fall and struggle. We hear their worries. We realize because we've lived longer that they'll grow and they'll move through and they'll find those doors that will close, but others will open at the same time. All they need is the ability to turn their head just slightly and see and seize the new opportunity. I imagine that God, if God is somewhat like a human being, that God as a parent smiles most of the time, even looking at our world and our lives and our worries, and says, when will they realize that they need to look at their world and their insight through my eyes and not theirs? And that's why I gave them not one, but 5 scrolls in that ark. That's why I gave them not word, but words to inspire them. That's why I gave them community so they wouldn't go through a fearful life fearful. That's why I gave them teachers and examples and models of what it means to live with challenge and even with pain. And with inner strength and inspiration to push back that heavy, heavy stone. Immovable to other people. Other shepherds watch you, they say, he'll never do it. She'll never at her age, with her back, push that off that well. But watch her. Because all she needs is what's inside her. It doesn't involve muscle or sinew or bone. It doesn't involve the kind of strength that our society values. It involves the kind of strength that we know we have within us. Because it's in that well. That well that Jacob pushed open so that others could be fed by one single source. So what is it that you're meant to do in this life that you haven't yet done? At age 72 or 55 or 46 or 12? Is it a painting? Is it a kind of generosity that you haven't yet given? Just to listen. Is it to find a stranger here who's a stranger to so many people? Because she comes every single time and no one comes close to her and puts their arms around her generously and says, I'm with you here. Is it the person whom you'll feed on Yom Kippur because you'll bring food that you don't need because thank God not only is your fridge full and your pantry full, but the fridge in the garage is full too? If you think about anger, if you think about envy, if you think about disappointment, if you think about regret, there's a cure for all of them. It's a singular cure, and it's gratitude. That's the greatest strength you have. You don't need arms. You don't need hands. You can be in any state of human ability or disability and push that heavy stone off that well with one simple fact, that you open your eyes to the blessings of who and how you are and watch that stone move. Think for a moment of who you are and how you are, with aches and pains and struggles, with worries that were, because you've let some go, with fears that might have been, but you're not gripping them, with people in your life that you love so much that you're going to release them to grow just as you did and do. And ask yourself if it's possible, even on the most difficult days or the dawns of difficult days, to say, thank you, God. This too is good. When Jacob came to that field, he didn't know what a rabbi would say centuries, generations later about that moment. But probably the author of Torah understood that always we would be wandering in our fields, and always we would see our abilities and our limitations, and often so many of us would stop at our limitations. And here the connection between an ancient man, probably in a cloth, something like this, a man in the desert, fleeing from fear, fleeing from hatred, fleeing from the enmity that he created. He merges somehow over generations and over centuries with a Hasidic man with a long beard who says, now I understand why you were standing in that insignificant moment in your life and in our scroll, our story. Because it's teaching us of the significance, the potential within every human being. So we stand beside that well and ask ourselves, Mi ani, who am I? Who am I that you gave me this point and place in my life? Who are you? Who am I that you gave me this holy potential within me? And who am I not to push back that heavy stone, not only for myself, but so that I might inspire others to do the same? Shana Tova. Happy, healthy New Year.